this video, I'm going to talk about wide receivers, which for many reasons are the most important position in all of DFS NFL. And I hope that this video leads you to have some light bulb moments about the position. First of all, wide receivers are the most volatile of all the positions in a DFS NFL lineup, which means that they're kind of the worst position to spend your salary on. And that's because by spending a lot of salary on wide receivers, you're usually trading off with running backs. And the elite running backs are just so much better in every way. They have much higher floors and they have much higher ceilings because nowadays the top running backs are catching 5 or 6 passes a game, sometimes as many as 10. I mean, last year, Christian McCaffrey had a game where he had over 100 receiving yards and over 100 rushing yards. It's just the kind of upside that is there for a running back who also gets the goal line carries with the amount of receptions that they haul in with their carries. And the fact that they get the goal line work, they score more than wide receivers. It's just hard for a running back to ever get below 10 points without an injury if he's someone at the level of Barkley or McCaffrey. And even the most elite wide receivers have really bad games sometimes. So for a variety of reasons, it's just better to spend your salary on running backs and go low at wide receiver. Running back matchups are also a lot easier to project. You really look at the offensive and defensive line. You look at the linebackers, safeties, how well do they all stop the run? That kind of stat is much easier to find. You can find exactly which holes they're most susceptible through. So you can look at, okay, which offensive team runs the ball the most through the holes that the defensive team is the most susceptible against. So it's just easier to project running backs overall. You can also look at how other pass-catching running backs have done against them in the past. Who was covering them? Was it a linebacker? Like Alvin Kamara against a linebacker, he's probably going to beat him. So if there's a team that always uses their linebackers to cover the running backs, great matchup. It's pretty cut and dry. Wide receivers, on the other hand, is very hard. And I'm going to show you a graphic right here to kind of explain why it's so difficult. So what you're looking at now is a receptions by coverage chart for Adam Thielen. This is showing when he caught each one of his passes or when he was targeted, who was covering him at the time. And most people make the mistake of thinking, a wide receiver has a cornerback covering him. It's a one-on-one matchup. They look at a coverage chart every week, and based on, who's lined up across from him, in theory, that's who they assume is going to cover him the whole game. It just doesn't work like that. It really doesn't. I mean, unless there's shadow coverage, which you can usually read about, or you can find an indication that this player is going to be shadowed by this cornerback. If you don't have shadow coverage, then you really don't know who's going to cover him. And so the point that we're trying to make is that there's going to be a half dozen defenders covering every wide receiver at every point in the game. So the matchup is all about the whole defense. Collectively, which zones of the field does this defense allow the most fantasy points to? And then look at similar receivers, look at the receivers on the team and see where do they run their routes. These are all things you can find. You can see, where are they catching all their balls? Where are they running all their routes? That's the kind of stuff that you want to look at way more than the cornerback covering him. In fact, I usually use the wide receiver and cornerback matchups as a way to fade receivers. Usually, if someone is matched up against a bad corner, I'll usually avoid picking that player, knowing that too many people will use them, just thinking that corner will cover them the whole game. It's just not how it works. And so the defensive game plan is by far the most important part, and it's almost impossible to predict. I mean, you can watch film, you can look at past trends, but teams make adjustments so often. A perfect example of when a defensive game plan just couldn't be predicted and totally changes everything was Week 11, 2018, Traquan Smith against the Eagles. And you can see his stats right here. He had 10 catches, 157 yards, and 1 touchdown. And he hadn't caught over 3 balls a single week prior to that all season. So, of course, his ownership goes way up for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks. And every single week, I'm like, this is an easy fade. It wasn't a difficult situation because the Eagles were playing a really unique defense that no team had tried against the Saints before, and it completely failed. They lost by 41. They were double bracketing Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara on every single play. I mean, how could Traquan Smith not catch 10 balls? I mean, he had one-on-one coverage with no safety help on every single play. If you watch the film, he wasn't Breeze's first look. Breeze is looking over at Thomas, he looks over at Kamara, he looks down the middle of the field, and by that time, Smith is open. not only was it not the Saints' game plan to get Smith more involved, so you shouldn't be playing Smith in the weeks after that, it also isn't the Eagles' game plan to just give up a huge game to a receiver. They're thinking, oh, we can stop him. Once they proved to themselves they couldn't stop a number 2, number 3 receiver and double the best players, they of course abandoned that strategy the next week. So ownership was up on Smith, ownership was up on whoever the number 2 receiver against the Eagles was, and all you had to do was look at the film. So you don't want to chase a really good game from a player without actually understanding why. So you need to understand, are they picking up yards and receptions on 3rd and 25 screen passes? Are they picking it up because a safety fell down? Which, by the way, is a good indicator of a bad defense sometimes if there's often safety miscommunication. But if a safety just falls over, if he just trips and falls, that's not a repeatable thing. So if a guy gets an 80-yard touchdown on that, you don't want to put any stock into that at all. So if you don't have a way of watching film or you don't have the time, you can still read the game logs, you can read the play-by-play logs and get some sense of it. And for the big plays, you can always watch the highlights. You can watch the condensed game highlights. It's like 10 to 15 minutes, and that'll show you all the plays that you want to see. But the aerial coaches film is the best way to really see every player on the field, where the quarterback's looking, where the safeties are looking. So that's the most helpful. Looking where the quarterback is looking first is so important. So if you really like a receiver and he's coming off some good games, make sure that the quarterback isn't always starting his reads with other players and the defense just happened to be hyper-focused on them. Because going forward, if the defense isn't hyper-focused on that player, that's the guy who's going to keep getting the looks, not your guy who's the 2nd or 3rd read on most offensive plays. So before we get into reasons that you should pick a player, a wide receiver, let's do one more reason why you shouldn't. And that's because a teammate is out. And it's so common in DFS NFL for, let's say AJ Green is out for the Bengals. Everybody rushes to pick everybody else on the Bengals, as if all the targets that went to Green will just then be funneled to the next best player. When in reality, there will probably be some kind of rotation of receivers who step into that spot, and they'll consume a lot of the volume because they're running the same plays. It's the same routes. They're just stepping into AJ Green's role. Sure, the quarterback is not going to force the ball to them as much as they might to a star player, but it's not going to just translate to a huge funnel of targets to somebody else. There's very few situations in the NFL where if one player is out, another guy is just a complete lock. Rarely happens, but what you'll see is that ownership on every single player on the team will go up, and those are good situations to avoid. The top guy being out, it's often a negative. The defense can start focusing more on other players. People don't really appreciate that a number 2 receiver might have the stats that he has because the defense doesn't give him any attention. Number 1 guy goes out. You don't know how the defense will adjust. You don't know how he'll adjust. Don't just make assumptions. It's really dangerous, and you're chasing high ownership and super unknown, volatile situations. So I really try to avoid those. The only time that I will target when a player's out is if there's already a precedent. I can already do some research and I can see what's going to happen. Like when Deshaun Jackson was out for the Buccaneers in 2018, they started playing Chris Godwin way more snaps. He went from like 50% to 85% snap rate. So that's something that, you can see that and you can draw a conclusion that that'll probably keep happening. But you definitely want to get some tangible evidence. You want to have some reason to believe something. Don't just chase the narrative that, the next best player will get all the targets. Let the public guess on those situations, and you only need 3 receivers in your lineup, so you don't need to force anything like that. Just go for the sure situations. And if you're going to go unsure, go low ownership. Do not go high ownership, volatility. It's a bad combination. So, look for the parts of the field where the defense is getting burned. That's the best way to pick and choose your receivers. So maybe a player might catch 3 passes for 80 yards against the team. Look into where were those passes caught on the field, which safety was on that side of the field, and try to figure out where are the vulnerabilities in the defense and where are the wide receivers running their routes, where are they catching their passes. If deep right is the vulnerability for a defense, that's something you can research, and you can actually research that for free on footballoutsiders.com. I have no affiliation to them, but it's a great website. They deserve the plug. They have free tools that show you every single part of the field and where the defense ranks in terms of how much they allow. The Chargers were an interesting example last year. They were third best team in short passes allowed, second worst team in deep passes allowed. And so you could really pick and choose your matchups, and you wanted to pick receivers who were getting all their targets down the field. And the Chargers were a super easy team to target for DFS, and they were a super easy team to fade. You're not going to pick Adam Humphries, who's running little slant routes all over the place. You would never pick him against the Chargers, and there's tons of more examples like that. Tyreek Hill would be a great play against the Chargers. So you just want to look for stuff like that. And I don't know of a free place that you can watch coaches film. I wish I did. It's a great resource. We pay for Pro Football Focus, so that's how we get it. It might be possible to find it online for free, but I'm really not aware of any place that you can do that. So the big takeaway here is just focus on routes, focus on where receivers get their passes from. What's the situation when they get their passes, when they make their big plays? Is it busted plays? Is it screen passes? Or are they a part of neutral offense, important plays, 1st and 10? Are they getting the first look? That's the kind of stuff that you want to be looking for when you're picking your receivers. And, this is where you win your GPPs. This is where you win the big contest. If you're starting your lineup with McCaffrey and Barkley, that's great. They're good picks, but they're not going to win you the contest. They're going to be 40% owned. So the receivers, the value receivers, is where you're going to win your contest. And so my next video, make sure you catch the third video. I'm going to talk about full lineup construction and ownership and how you go about actually taking down a big GPP. So that's the last video I have planned for you in this mini series, and I hope you've been enjoying it so far.